On the morning of October 4th, 1975, a cattle rancher named Dale Coburn walked out to the south pasture on his place outside Kim, Colorado, and found one of his heifers dead in the frost. That, by itself, was not strange. Cattle die. Dale had run 2,400 acres of high, dry grassland in Los Animas County most of his life, and buried plenty of animals. What stopped him that morning was the quiet. No coyotes had come in the night. No magpies were working the carcass. The dog would not follow him past the stock tank. And when he knelt in the cold grass, he saw that the work done to the animal was clean. The udder was gone, and one ear taken in a smooth oval, and there was no blood. Not on the grass, not in the animal, not anywhere. The ground around her was dry and undisturbed, except for a wide ring of shallow circular depressions pressed into the dirt, which Dale counted, without quite knowing why he was counting, and got to 15. His truck was parked 40 feet away. When he climbed back in to drive to the house and telephone the vet, the clock on the dash had stopped. It read 2:47. He had left the house that morning at 6:15. Dale Coburn did not call the sheriff that day. He would tell his granddaughter, almost 20 years later, on a cassette tape she kept in a shoebox, that he already understood something the rest of us are still arguing about. He said the animal had not been killed. He said it had been read. Let's start with what we know. What we know is that this had happened before and would happen thousands of times after. 8 years before Dale knelt in that frost, in September of 1967, a 3-year-old Appaloosa mare named Lady was found dead on a ranch near Alamosa, Colorado, about 160 miles west of Dale's fence line. The press got her name wrong and called her Snippy, and the wrong name stuck. And that is how the country came to know her. The skin and flesh had been stripped from her head and neck down to bright, clean bone. There was no blood at the scene. There was a strong, sweet, medicinal odor in the air, something like acetone, that more than one person noticed, and no one could explain. The Alamosa County Sheriff told the family it was probably a lightning strike and never drove out to look. That is the case that started all of it. The first to go nationwide. The first time anyone in America said out loud the word that would haunt this subject for the next 60 years. Aliens. I want to be careful here, because the temptation with a story like Dale's is to make him the center of the universe. And he was not. He was one rancher in one county in one very strange decade. By the time his heifer went down in the fall of 1975, the thing he had walked into was already a wave. In October of 1975 alone, mutilated livestock were reported across 8 different states in the same span of weeks. In Colorado, the governor, Richard Lamb, called it one of the greatest outrages in the history of Western cattle raising. That is a sitting governor, on the record. Ranchers were sleeping in their trucks with rifles across their laps. And the pattern from Montana down through Colorado and New Mexico into Texas was monotonous in its sameness. A downed animal, soft tissue removed with what looked like precision, the sex organs, the rectum, an ear, an eye, the tongue, the udder, no blood, often no tracks, sometimes a light the night before. That is not one rancher's ghost story. That is a documented, multi-state, federally acknowledged wave, and Dale Coburn was standing in the exact middle of it. And here is where it stops being ordinary. Dale's second animal went down 11 days after the first. A bull calf this time in the same 40-acre section on the south end. The section his dog, a blue heeler named Sheba, still would not enter. He called a veterinarian out of Trinidad, a practical man named Harlan Pryor, who had polled 10,000 calves and did not believe in much he could not stitch shut. Pryor looked at the calf a long time, then went quiet in a way Dale said he never forgot. The wound that took the animal's lower jaw and tongue was not, in Pryor's word, a cut. He said it looked separated, as if the tissue had been parted rather than sliced. No ragged edge, no torn hide, no sign of a blade catching anywhere along it. And there was something on the exposed muscle, a pale waxy film, faintly sweet, that Pryor had never seen on a carcass in 30 years. He scraped a little into a jar, took tissue for a necropsy, and said he would send it to the veterinary lab at Colorado State, in Fort Collins. Dale wrote the date in his cattle ledger, the ledger he kept his whole life. And in it, decades later, his granddaughter would find no lab result, no letter, no bill, no line at all. Whatever came back, if anything came back, is not in the file. That is the first hole. Hold on to it. There will be more. If you had told Dale in 1975 that the federal government would one day open a genuine investigation into the thing in his pasture, he would not have believed you. In his experience, the government's whole relationship to the mutilations was to look at the ground and shrug. But it did happen. On the 20th of April, 1979, a United States senator convened a public conference on cattle mutilations at the Albuquerque Public Library. And not just any senator. Harrison Schmitt, Republican of New Mexico, was a geologist who had flown on Apollo 17 and walked on the surface of the moon. About 180 people came, sheriffs and state police and tribal governors, and Los Alamos scientists and ranchers in worn hats. Schmitt told the room that there are few things more dangerous than an unsolved pattern of crime, and that in at least 15 states, animals had been killed and systematically mutilated for no apparent purpose by persons unknown. In that room, a businessman named Paul Benowitz walked up to a New Mexico state police officer and said he had been photographing strange lights over Kirtland Air Force Base. Remember Paul Benowitz. His story ends somewhere very dark, and we will get there. That officer was Gabe Valdez, and if this whole subject has a patron saint, it might be him. Valdez was a New Mexico state policeman working the empty country around Dulce, up near the Colorado line, and he had documented mutilations for years, the way a good cop documents anything. In February of 1979, he examined a mutilated bull found in Torrance County, and afterward told the press that the laboratory work had turned up 2 drugs in the animal's tissue. Not teeth marks, not predators, drugs. Valdez did not say aliens. For most of his life, he pointed the other way, at his own government. But he was certain of one thing, and he said it plainly, to anyone who would listen. Whatever was doing this was not a coyote. The pressure worked, at least on paper. In March of 1979, the FBI was formally instructed to look into mutilations on Indian lands in New Mexico, where the Bureau actually held jurisdiction. That summer, the district attorney in Santa Fe secured a federal grant and hired a retired FBI agent named Kenneth Rommel to run a dedicated investigation. They called it Operation Animal Mutilation. Rommel had spent 28 years in the Bureau, and he was, by every account, a thorough and deeply skeptical man. In June of 1980, he delivered a report that ran 297 pages, and its conclusion was blunt. The mutilations he had personally inspected, about 25 of them, were the work of predators and scavengers. The surgical precision, he argued, was an illusion of grief and decomposition. He even tested a great piece of physical evidence. Residents near Taos had collected gray flakes they believed had fallen from a craft. Rommel sent them to the FBI crime laboratory, which reported that the mysterious gray flakes were ordinary acrylic house paint. I want to give that explanation its full weight, because it is a good one, and the people who repeat it are not fools. Scavengers really do take the soft tissue first, the lips and eyes and tongue and genitals and rectum. Exactly the parts everyone kept finding gone. Blood really does settle to the low points of a dead animal and get consumed. Gas and bloat really do split hide along clean, straight lines that look to a shaken rancher over his own steer at dawn, like the work of a scalpel. And in the Snippy case itself, two college students in Alamosa eventually confessed they had snuck out and shot the horse weeks after the panic began. A careful, entirely earthly explanation covers a great deal of this, maybe most of it. Any honest look at the subject has to sit with that, and I have. But here is where it stops covering everything. Rommel inspected about 25 animals. Ranchers and law officers across the West were reporting them by the thousands. Predation does not explain the two drugs Valdez said were found in that Torrance County bull. It does not explain the pale waxy film on Dale Coburn's calf that a 30-year veterinarian had never once seen. It does not explain why the samples went to Fort Collins, and no result ever came back. And it does not explain the silence. Scavengers are loud. They leave tracks, drag marks, scattered bone, a mess. The thing every rancher says first is how clean these scenes were and how quiet. No coyotes came. That absence is not a detail. That absence is the whole case. The deeper I went, the stranger the picture became. This story also had a national chronicler. In 1980, a Colorado journalist named Linda Moulton Howe investigated cases around Walsenburg near Dale's country and released a documentary called A Strange Harvest. Skeptics say she pushed the evidence too far, but her cameras kept finding the same thing. Plain-spoken ranchers with no reason to want the attention, standing over their own dead animals, describing the precision, the bloodlessness, the quiet. The most grounded people in America, frightened, unable to make it fit. Somewhere in this part of the investigation, I came across a document I have not been able to fully account for, and it changed how I read everything before it. It is a self-published monograph from 1996, 41 pages, titled The Quiet Count. The copy I hold is a photocopy of a photocopy, the type going soft at the margins, passed to me by the son of a MUFON field investigator who died in 2011. The author gives his name only as Owen Rell and calls himself a retired range scientist. I have not been able to confirm that a man by that name ever existed, and I want to be honest about that. But whoever wrote it had walked a great many pastures. His argument was strange and simple. He said the thing everyone got wrong about the mutilations was the word killing. If you laid out the cases by date and location and which tissue was taken, what you saw was not slaughter. It was sampling. It was, in his phrase, a quiet count. Something was taking inventory of the living things in a place, one specimen at a time. Cattle first, because cattle are many and cattle are watched. And the taking was so precise and so bloodless because the death was never the point. The point was the reading. The reading. That word again. Because Dale Coburn had written almost exactly the same thing in his ledger in 1975. In his own hand, a man who had never heard of Owen Rell and never would. After the third animal, he wrote one line beneath the date. It's not taking, it's reading. I have held that ledger page. It's not taking, it's reading. I do not know what a rancher in Kim, Colorado, and a maybe invented range scientist a state away were both reaching for with that word. I only know they reached for the very same one. And then, in the winter of 1976, the animals stopped, and something else started. This is the part of Dale's story I approached most carefully, because it is the part with no bodies, no lab samples, nothing to photograph. According to the cassette his granddaughter Nella recorded in 1994, when Dale was 63 and his hands had already begun to shake, the last of his 7 animals went down in December of 1976. And after that, the pasture went still and the reports changed. They stopped being about cattle. Dale said that across that final winter, 3 separate times, He saw figures standing at the south fence line at first light. Small, chest high to a fence post. Gray, or gray the way the sky is gray before the sun comes up. More absence than color. They did not move the way people move. They stood at the wire and did not cross it, the same wire his dog would not cross. And they seemed, he said, to be looking at the herd, counting it. Counting the herd. That is the phrase on the tape. Now, a shaking old man on a cassette is not evidence, and I would set it aside if it stood alone. It does not stand alone. Dale placed those figures in the same handful of months that produced the single most investigated abduction case in American history. On the 5th of November, 1975, a logging crew near Snowflake, Arizona, watched a young man named Travis Walton walk toward a glowing disc, get struck by a beam of light, and drop. His crew fled. Walton vanished for 5 days and returned describing small beings with oversized heads and enormous dark eyes in a clean, white room. Same year, same rural West, and the figures Dale described, the height, the head, the eyes, like holes rather than eyes, match what a New Hampshire couple named Betty and Barney Hill had described back in 1961. Under hypnosis, with a Boston doctor named Benjamin Simon, years before Dale or Walton had any template to borrow from. The gray, with the great black eyes, keeps arriving in the testimony of people with no plausible way to have coordinated it. And in 1992, researchers polled nearly 6,000 American adults and published the results as unusual personal experiences. Whatever this is, it is not one lonely rancher in Kim, Colorado. I found one more thing near Dale's country that I cannot let go of. In Branson, Colorado, 20 miles south, a rancher named Lorraine Six lost 2 animals the same way in those same years, clean and bloodless and quiet. Her account survives in a single 1978 letter to a livestock paper, which a local historian photocopied for me. In it, she mentions, almost in passing, as if it embarrassed her, that the autumn her cattle died, she kept finding her yard dog at the edge of the north field at dawn, staring at nothing. And that twice she saw what she took for children standing at her fence in the half-dark, until she realized no child stands that still. She never used the word alien. She stopped talking about it, she wrote, because people talked back. 2 ranches, 20 miles apart, the same dog at the same fence, at the same hour, staring at the same nothing. That is the kind of echo you cannot unhear. The strongest thing I have to show you, though, is not any of the testimony. It is the shape of the holes. Remember, Paul Benowitz, the man at Schmidt's conference, with his photographs of lights over Kirtland. Benowitz spent years convinced he had uncovered something real near the base. And what happened to him next is, in its own way, more disturbing than any abduction. According to the researcher Greg Bishop, who documented the affair in his 2005 book Project Beta, certain government figures did not simply ignore Benowitz. They fed him. They funneled him fabricated documents and false leads until the man could no longer tell his own findings from the fiction, walked deliberately into his life, and his mental health broke apart under the weight of it. That is documented history. And it tells you the record around this subject is not merely thin by accident. Sometimes it is thinned on purpose by people who know exactly what they are doing, so lay the holes down side by side. Dale's necropsy samples sent to Fort Collins, no result on file. The Los Animas County Sheriff's Log, where the case number for Dale's herd sits between 2 others with a gap of 7 months and no entries in between, as if someone had stopped writing and started again later. Gabe Valdez's 2 drugs reported to the press in 1979 and then gone from the official story. Rommel inspecting 25 carcasses out of thousands and closing the book. The gray flakes that got a full crime lab workup because they were safe to explain, while the pale waxy film on Dale's calf was sent away and never named. The record thins exactly where it should thicken. Every time the trail reaches the one detail that would not fit the ordinary story, the paper runs out. I do not think that requires a grand conspiracy of men in a locked room. I think the truth might be quieter, and in some ways, worse. A bureaucracy that meets something it cannot categorize will, at every fork, choose the path that generates the least paper. Do not test what you cannot explain. Do not file what you cannot resolve. Do not open a question you have no idea how to close. That is not a cover-up. That is an institution flinching over and over for 50 years. And it leaves exactly the record we have. There is one more earthly answer I owe you, and it is the best one. In December of 1967, the government detonated a nuclear device deep underground near Dulce, New Mexico, in an experiment called Project Gas Buggy. Gabe Valdez's own family came to believe the mutilations were the government itself quietly testing the region's cattle for radiation in the fallout country, and doing it in secret to avoid a panic. That theory is grounded. It explains the drugs, the helicopters people reported, the official silence without a single alien in it, and I find it persuasive for some share of the cases. But it does not explain the figures at Dale Coburn's fence, or at Lorraine Six's, or the height and the black eyes that match a Boston hypnosis transcript from 1961. A radiation survey does not stand chest high at the wire at first light and count your cattle. Something in this refuses to reduce all the way down. I want to tell you the most ordinary thing in this whole file, because it is the thing that finally convinced me Dale Coburn was not lying. After the seventh animal, he sold the herd. His nerve was gone. But his granddaughter says that for the rest of his life, more than 30 years, Dale walked out to that south pasture at first light almost every morning, to the empty pasture, no cattle left to check, and counted the fence posts. Out loud, she heard him do it as a girl and thought it was only an old man's habit. She understands it differently now. And when Ruth Coburn, Dale's wife, died in 2011, 2 years after Dale, Nella cleaned out the kitchen and found in the back of a drawer a cracked yellow ear tag and the business card of a Trinidad veterinarian named Harlan Pryor from a practice closed decades before. Ruth had kept them 35 years, beside the twine and the rubber bands, and never once mentioned them. People do not keep the ear tag of a dead heifer for 35 years over a coyote. So here is what is left: a cattle ledger with one line in a dead man's hand. It's not taking, it's reading. A 43-minute cassette with a gap on side B where something was recorded over. A photocopy of a monograph by a man who may never have existed. A sheriff's log with a 7-month hole in it. A cracked ear tag in a kitchen drawer. And a pasture outside Kim, Colorado, where an old man counted fence posts to empty air until the year he died. I told you at the start that I would not tell you what it was. And I won't, because I do not know. But I know the difference between a lie and a secret. A lie is smooth. You can run your hand along the length of a lie and feel nothing catch. This is not smooth. This is jagged all the way down. It snags on a substance no laboratory named, on a dog that would not cross a wire, on 2 ranches 20 miles apart with the same still figure at the same fence at the same gray hour. That is not the texture of a story someone made up. That is the texture of a thing someone tried to write down and could not finish. So, I am left with the questions, and I will hand them to you the way they came to me. What reads a herd one animal at a time and leaves no blood on the ground? Why the cattle first? And why the tongue, the eye, the udder, the parts that taste and see and feed? What stands at a fence line and counts and does not cross? What did Gabe Valdez's 2 drugs actually do, and where did that report go? Who put a 7-month hole in a county sheriff's log? And who taught a whole bureaucracy to flinch? If Owen Rell was invented, then who invented him, and why would anyone bother? And if he was real, where did he go? What Dale Coburn see 3 times at his south fence in the winter of 1976 that he carried alone for 30 years and told, in the end, only to a cassette tape. And if it was counting the herd, as he said, then here is the one question I cannot put back down. When it finished counting the cattle, whose count came next? Dale sold the herd. He counted the fence posts alone, out loud, until 2009. The visitor came to the wire, and it did not cross, or it was still counting, and he was simply the last one left to check.